All right. Last time, unfortunately, I left the desktop audio on. Find myself being overblown by music, so um, even this one's a bit loud right now. So I'll just go at it again. I don't know if I'm going to read the same thing over. I'm just going to continue where I left off. Okay, these two conditions are therefore coherent with a range of different views that do not endorse the HST. Often we still ought to reject less inclusive views of dignity, and a kind of dignity ought to extend beyond the human to include non-human animals and all vulnerable humans. First, what encourages proponents of the HST to defend it is a norm in contemporary human rights practice that says we ought to include all human beings as bearers of dignity regardless of physical differences. Restricting dignity's scope would be incoherent with this norm. We should not leave the rights of vulnerable humans lacking the intrinsic valuable natural properties we might identify, such as rational agency, hanging by a thread. To do so not only runs against the whole direction of human rights jurisprudence. That's interesting. Never heard of that word. Hmm. A theory of philosophy of law. That tells me nothing. A theoretical study of law. Okay, again, tells me nothing. Jurisprudence, but would be morally disastrous, amounting to the legislation of certain mistreatment. The extension proposal captures this because it means including all humans, with one revision that it is not only humans but also animals who are included. In other words, if it is morally undesirable to exclude some humans but include but sorry whoa, whoa. If it's morally undesirable to exclude some humans but the HST is unjustifiable, then the only remaining option is for dignity to extend to non-human animals. Second, the extension proposal also coheres with a growing literature which considers and includes non-human animals as right holders because of the moral relevance of certain shared properties, including, for instance, sentience, the capacity for basic agency, and the capacity to form social bonds. A shared concept of dignity beyond the human would capture this with advantage for human rights. Both animals and humans would receive legal protection, and dignity/rights would achieve a solid foundation. Much like the scope challenge, the idea that animals possess dignity is not new. Nonetheless, it coheres and continuity with human dignity has received little attention. Part of this, the reason for this, is I suspect, is that the full force of the scope challenge against HST has not been recognized. I have argued this is a mistake. The scope challenge is sufficiently convincing to encourage us to revise our understanding of dignity, to include non-human animals, and to include them in the human rights following on from dignity as well. By drawing on coherent human rights practice, we ought to reconstruct a more plausible account of dignity beyond the human. In the next chapter, I turn to that task. Sentience as the basis of dignity. I nowhere I read through chapter 1. Oh, I did. Introduction. In this chapter, I defend a novel account of the basis of dignity, one that extends beyond the human. I argue that it is because they value states of affairs, objects, and activities that both non-humans and humans have dignity. This capacity to value comprises two conditions. One, the possession of teleological interest, that is, the possession of an end which, if achieved or obstructed, would be good/bad for the entity that possesses it, the interest condition. Two, the capacity to experience modifiable mental states, the consciousness condition. Many non sentient organic entities, such as plants, fulfill the first condition alone. What sets sentient creatures apart is that they fulfill both conditions, meaning that they experience what it is like to benefit and be benefited and harmed by the achievements and obstruction of their ends. In other words, If a being, oh my god, I just realized something. Oh, never mind. It's good. It's good. Oh, where is it? There. And that can be benefited or harm them. I then claim they can value some objects, activities, and states of affairs over others, and therefore they have dignity. Put formally, I argue that the above two conditions generate valent sentience, the capacity to value the achievement and maintenance of particular ends in of themselves. To illustrate, one of the ends that squirrels possess is the bearing of nuts in the autumn. In the same way, you might possess the same end of spending time with friends, but because you both have the capacity to experience mental states that changes over time, your ends hold huge importance to each of you. They structure your lives. You act in ways that will help you pursue and achieve your ends and try to prevent those ends being undermined or obstructed. For instance, maintaining your friendship might be hugely important to you, so you might spend time with your friends often as a result. Similarly, because a squirrel highly values the bearing of their nuts, in the autumn, gathering and bearing nuts takes a majority of their time. When our ends are achieved or obstructed, we can be affected in a myriad of different ways. We and our fellow creatures experience pain, joy, grief, sound, sight, and a host of different emotions and sensory inputs, which color our experiences. Claim that it is this coloring which explains why some entities and not others are vulnerable to being directly wronged. This coloring gives rise to the act. The moment I see a list of joy, pain, blah, 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 it's going to be the case that someone's going to give you a hypothetical whereby you have only one trait, and whether or not an entity with only one trait, let's see, the ability to see, is going to be valuable. This coloring gives rise to the fact that, well, if sight is going to be valuable, but its value is only derivative of sentience, then you can't really, um, there's no real way to reduct to that. Uh, this coloring gives rise to the act of valuing one thing over the other, and with it gives rise to a being's dignity. Unlike a rock, an entity, a dignity bearer values the things that happen to it. To arrive at the claim that all bearers of the capacity to value have dignity, I proceed through 5 steps. In step 1, I start by clarifying the most plausible means of answering the question of which beings do and do not belong or have dignity, using consideration from previous chapters as springboard. In step 2, I defend the interest and consciousness condition as necessary and jointly sufficient for the scope of dignity. Next, in step 3, I explain why I take the combined meaning of these two conditions to be valent sentience, and I argue since this property comprises a capacity to value, this interpretation of sentience develops on the traditional sentience account insofar as it is explanatorily deeper and captures a greater range of experiential inputs. In the 4th steps, I present an argument for why the capacity to value has intrinsic value. In the final step, section 2.7, I tie the account of dignity together. I argue that the capacity to value grounds our dignity if and because we should think of the intrinsic value of it as providing basic idiotic reasons that generate right claims. 2.2, the question of scope. We have already seen that a successful account of dignity must meet the two conditions. One, not the natural grounding condition. Dignity should be grounded in an inherent natural property or properties of a being. Two, the intrinsic value condition. The natural properties grounded in dignity must have intrinsic value. The natural property that grounds dignity should cohere with the scope of application of the concept of dignity, so that all beings with relevant properties are included in the class of beings with dignity. If the capacity to value is the basis of dignity, as I will argue, then all beings of it ought to be included in the class of being with dignity. As I argue in chapter 1, this is because coherence is a general condition on epistemic justification. Because of this, the above two conditions are consistent with Rawls' method of reflective equilibrium. Reflective equilibrium seeks to achieve the most plausible understanding of the principle of morality. Principles which cohere with certain conditions and convictions about wrong and can reasonably justify to others. This method is therefore neither purely naturalistic nor conventionalist in its justification. Instead, it draws on both strategies. I will assume that this approach is plausible. Instead, I want to explain how it applies to the question of the scope of dignity. Even if we fulfill the two above conditions, how will we know that the account I offered is the right one? The problem cases will be ones in which the fundamental principles do not cohere with our convictions. For instance, the natural property that grounds dignity might generate a scope of application that do not fit with our convictions about which beings ought to have dignity. As we saw in chapter 1, this can be plausible grounds for rejecting an account. I claim that we should not restrict the scope of dignity to include only some humans, but instead we should extend dignity beyond the human. One reason for this is down to the moral undesirability of excluding some humans from an account of dignity, the conviction that drives the conventionalist about dignity. But a second reason is because of the moral relevance of certain shared properties between humans and non-humans. As such, our considered convictions are working in two ways that have already helped us determine what kind of properties might ground dignity. One possessed by all humans and by at least some non-humans. So even if we were to discover a natural property of intrinsic value that might ground dignity, but which some humans lack, such as agency, we would have good reason to reject that property as a basis of dignity because it fails to cohere with its considered convictions. However, we do not have convictions about who ought to be included in an account of dignity, but who ought to be excluded. Many people think that rocks don't have dignity, but some also hold that cows, bees, and fish don't as well. If we give a justificatory weight to convictions about who ought to be included in an account of dignity, then shouldn't we also give weight to these beliefs about who ought to be excluded? And since this will produce conflict with certain properties that might grant dignity, how ought those conflicts to be resolved? To answer these questions, an important clarification is needed. Reflective equilibrium is not about giving unexamined weight to our beliefs. Convictions about particular cases of when and whether a wronging occurs acts as a provisional judgment point for determining whether any particular conception of dignity is correct. To be sure, if we have an intuition about that non-human animals do not have dignity, then that intuition ought to be investigated to see if there's any coherence and well justified reason for holding this. However, if it is found that there is no good reason or the reason are incoherent with other principles and convictions, then that intuition ought to be rejected. On the intuition about excluding non-human animals, I think this is likely the correct conclusion. This intuition is more likely to come from speciesist ideas than from well-considered theoretical positions. This is an instance in which a conviction ought to be revised if and because it fails to cohere with a general justificatory picture. In other words, we ought to seek coherence between our beliefs and the justificatory basis for holding them. Where conflicts arise, we revise those beliefs, which are the least plausible to hold, produce the most coherent incoherence, or otherwise have morally undesirable implications. Using this method, I will argue that valence sentience, comprising the capacity to value, is the basis for dignity. The process of reflective equilibrium tests this by leading us to consider our moral reactions to the proposal that particular properties should ground dignity and how they fit within broader consideration of value and its moral relevance. However, note that while I provide an account of the basis of dignity, I do not aim to solve the question of the scope. We do not have the comfort of a sharp line drawing when it comes to questions of this sort, for two reasons. The first are epistemic limitations regarding knowledge of animals, lives, and experiences. The second are down to conceptual ones. We might be uncertain of that for all animals it is a simple question of saying they either do or don't have dignity. Rather than a sharp line of drawing, I aim to align the kinds of beings whose lives do not and do have moral importance associated with dignity. Section 2.3 to 2.4 will focus on determining the necessary and sufficient conditions. for this, but I understand those conditions to identify gray areas. To justify these conditions, I will argue I will largely rely on thought experiments. While this means that it may not be immediately obvious which beings on the very margins fulfill the condition, I will settle I will settle upon relying on thought experiments is the most plausible approach. This is because it adopts a theory light perspective, according to which we search for markers of the relevant conditions rather than aiming to discover clear cut evidence of them. On the one hand, real world cases can be contested because research is still being done into measuring consciousness. The lines are therefore blurred. On the other hand, thought experiments will allow me to specify about what characteristics are necessary for a being to have vulnerability to wrongdoing or wronging. I think this is probably my heart just dropped for a second because while I'm reading this, I can feel I had a flash to this an imagination of someone creating a rebuttal whereby they bring up, let's say, an ant and say, should we morally value ants for whatever this or whatever that reason? Because ants, let's say, have some sort of valent sentience to which they again can value objects, things, and activities. Do they then have intrinsic moral value? um I've looked into ants. It is said that they have some rudimentary sentience, or at least none at all, because there's some quivy on whether or not they have anything. Um, but it's just gonna be assumed, and I think this theory of light would say that they do show markers of sentience. Um, so whether or not, uh, but I saw another paper that said beetles that have rudimentary salience shouldn't or couldn't never be um say dignity bearers. He didn't give a specific argument for why. Actually, I might just look at it right now because I'm curious to what the rest of that article said. I think it's called Non-Humans. It was just released in 2025. I'm deathly curious about the article. It's only 8 pages and I just might read it right now just to get that off my head. Boom. Okay. Uh, let's find the article. Shall non-humans something something, but because I don't label, I don't properly put these things in boxes like they're very a little difficult to find. Okay. Uh, let me just open. What if I just paste it out like this? Okay, there you go. Did you change it? Okay, there you go. I just need to key search beetle. uh, beetle. There you go. The suggestion that dignity for certain sentient and perhaps other beings is tied not just to being morally considerable, but also having substantially or high moral significance make some intuitive sense. A beetle, a microorganism, or a plant could conceivably have some inherent value and be morally considerable, but few will think that they have very high moral significance, even if, say, beetles have rudimentary sentience. According, Accordingly, it would be implausible to regard them as sentient holders. I don't know why, though. Why would it be wrong to consider a beetle a sentient holder if they do have rudimentary sentience? I want to hear why. By contrast, it may seem more plausible to claim that animals such as beetles, such as dogs, whales, elephants, monkeys, crows, and cows, and pigs, have sufficient moral significance to qualify as dignity holders. Harming or killing these individuals, even for relatively important purposes, would often wrong them. When a being such as a dog, elephant, or pig is wronged, we might want to say that their dignity has been violated, as we may say for wronged human beings. Clearly, this represents a very different way of talking about animals than most people are accustomed to. Some advocates will argue that if animals have dignity at all, it must be equal to the dignity of humans because humans and animals have the same moral significance. An argument to this end, with a familiar structure, is by Singer 2009, goes as followed: that humans may be said to have dignity due to certain capacities, such as advanced language, rationality, or moral autonomy. Oh, the stutters. However, humans who permanently lack these capacities, example due to irreversible brain damage at birth, are usually thought to have equal dignity with humans who have those capacities. If that animal with capacities similar to people with this disability also possess equal dignity. Oh my god. The mere fact of belonging to a different species should make no difference to the level of dignity. Whether or not animals and humans have equal dignity, that implication might follow for animal possessing a dignity associated with high moral difference. A human dignity of the current type is not contingent but inalienable or unconditional, and so incapable of being lost or gained. Likewise, animal dignity would be unconditional. Thus, an animal who is disabled, ill, dangerously aggressive, living in squalor, or designated as a pest may be said to retain their full dignity and significance, even if society rarely values them. What precisely such an animal dignity entails for moral agents could be debated, but some would say that much of animal treatment in science, sports, farming, and in the wild wrongs the animal and violates their dignity. 3. Dignity relation to flourishing and nature and justice. The second conception ties dignity to animal nature as beings that can flourish in various ways. Animals, this view stresses, are not mere sensated biological organisms, but rather individuals with extensive capacities, needs, potential. These include desiring and pursuing goals, referring to certain capacities, activities, preferring certain activities, maintaining relationships, trying to stay alive and healthy, and experiencing different emotions. Martha Nussberg suggests that animal dignity resides in the possibility of individual flourishing according to certain core capacities, which determine what it is for creatures' life to go well. Each animal species, including humans, have similar general capacities. Capabilities. Although their manifestation vary, for example, the capacity of play and forming relationships are shared across many species, but the ways in which humans, dolphins, and giraffes play and form relationships have salient differences. Dignity, so understood, also has ethical implications. For example, allowing animals to flourish may be a requirement of Justice. Nussbaum, 2023, believes the treatment of animals in farming, science, entertainment, zoos, etc., is frequently unjust. It typically fails to provide life's worth of dignity. Nussbaum, of these animals who, by denying them opportunities for flourishing according to their nature. Billions of animals are forced to have sort impoverished existence rather than long flourishing lives. This deprivation, say Duisburg, is a waste and a tragedy for which humans are often culpable. Indeed, such neediness and vulnerability to have diminished lives shared by humans and non-humans alike may be considered internal to this kind of dignity. A relevant debate arose after the Swiss introduced dignity into a 1992 constitutional amendment about genetically engineered living things. Some argue that genetic engineering that damages bodily integrity or severely reduces species' typical capacities, such as albiting vision, hearing, or feeling, is wrongful affront to animal dignity, even if such diminished animals are actually better off in the exploitative condition they are subjected to. Others argue that engineering individuals that are genetically incapable of flourishing in species typical ways, but that would not otherwise exist, or are often radically novel natures, or suffer less in farming or science, is morally acceptable and or cannot offend their dignity. Although we cannot adjudicate these debates here, the Swiss example points to a kind of dignity related to animal nature's flourishing and associated with ethical requirements. Respectively, a quite different relational approach conceives of animal dignity as socially orientated ways of morally recognizing and treating animal individual. Note that this relational dignity does not reduce to inherent worth or to flourishing, even if there are salient conceptual connections between such dignity and moral worth or flourishing nature. Brother, social dignity does not merely describe the value or respect society happen to accord or withhold from individuals. Rather, it refers to treatments and behaviors that do or do not express or embody appropriate and justified moral respect and acknowledgement of an individual. This strongly relational aspect renders such dignity more contingent than the foregoing kinds. Indeed, social dignity usually manifests as failures to recognize moral worth, including outright moral ne- Wait, what happened to the music? What happened to the songs? What happened to all the? I'm still watching. I'm still watching. I've always been watching. I'm like, oh, brother. Okay. Okay. All right. So, um, um, what am I? What? I don't even. And if the term dignity, even some pro-animal thinkers are skeptical, and if I'm, oh, brother, I'm confused. Where am I? Where? What? I'm confused. How does this respectively a different kind of relational approach conceives of the animal dignity as socially orientated ways of morally recognizing and treating animals? Know that this relational dignity does not reduce to inherent worth or to flourishing, even if there are salient conceptual connections between such dignity and moral worth or flourishing nature. Social dignity does not merely describe the value or respect society happen to accord or withhold from individuals. Rather, it refers to the treatment and behavior that do or do not express or embody appropriate, justified moral respect and acknowledgement of an individual. This strongly relational aspect renders such dignity more contingent than the foregoing kinds. Indeed, social dignity usually Ah, brother, you know me. On dude, do I read this one or this one? Where am I, dude? Pink mouths, clowns. What am I doing? Am I even at the right page? Dude, am I losing? Yeah, I read this already. I read through this. Swiss including. Shouldn't I then? Okay, I finish read this. I then have to read over here. Yes? Yes, of course. Of course. And then after I finish reading this part, I then read this. What am I confused about? Okay, never mind. Social dignity does not merely describe what how you place value on something or respect, etc. Social happen to occur with according to withhold from individuals. Rather, it refers to treatment and behavior that uh, do or do not express or embody appropriate and justified moral respect and acknowledgement of an individual. This strongly at this strongly relational aspect. I don't know why I didn't just say strong, but okay, wrong one. Okay, finish that. Finish that. Go up here. Right here. Embody appropriate, justify moral respect. I'm check something. Okay, checked. All right. Okay. Uh, where's the thing? I accidentally clicked off. Okay. Appropriate. I guess these. Never mind. Why are you going on? Such dignity. Anyone? No, no, no. Or embody appropriate, justified moral respect and acknowledgement of an individual. This strongly relational aspect renders such dignity more contingent than the foregoing kinds. Indeed, social dignity usually manifests as failures to recognize moral worth, including outright moral denigration. Uh, denigration, including outright moral denigration. When this belittlement occurs, we may feel that the animal has been degraded and their dignity violated. Consider some in illustrations. Many people now object to circuses uh, in which abruptly can cost. Dude, dude, what is going on? Hope I'm not getting a stroke or anything. Okay, including outright moral denigration. When this belittlement occurs, we may feel that the why can't I read this? When this belittlement occurs, we may feel the animal has been degraded and their dignity violated. Consider some illustrations. Many people now object to circuses in which abruptly costumes animals. And what is going on? What is going on? Okay, let's go again. Focus. Consider some illustrations. Many people now object to circuses in which abruptly costumed animals perform tricks that promote audience laughter or prompt audience laughter. Many people also now object to portraying animals such as great apes in TV ads and movies as funny looking humans prone to jarring animal outbursts. Um, Lori describes a chimpanzee trainer for comedic entertainment to respond to humans with ridiculous facial expressions, producing a clown-like appearance with a big pink mouth. Gooden invites us to perceive here a dignity violation. Similar feelings may emerge toward zoos which display animals as public exhibits, even for laudable goals. At least some people regard such animals as being demeaned and perhaps humiliated. Despite the animals themselves being oblivious, such treatment seemingly contains the idea that these animals have little value as individuals, even if they are valued, say, as representatives of rare and beautiful species. And even if no belittlement is explicitly intended on the social dignity account, the indignity consists with the communicative expression of this dismissive viewpoint. Conversely, treating account of human dignity as a moral form of social status, certain treatment and social structures can reinforce or undermine recognition of the equal value of human individuals, thus affecting their social moral rank or status. Killmister 2020. Racist language and systems, for example, vividly embody a derogatory perspective of the other's lesser value. and Etison 2020. Treatment such as state-sanctioned torture and sexual humiliation of adversities. What? Adversaries. Oh my god. Are other powerful expressions of degraded moral worth. I've slept well. I don't know what's going on. As an expressive view of dignity, that relation to act that embody and communicate moral attitudes about animals, social dignity need not involve any natural harm. Indeed, the recipient of indignity may be unaware or even accepting of such treatment. At issue here is not just the extent expressive qualities might promote the future cruel treatment of animals, though that too can be important moral issue, which even those respectively hostile, some degrading treatment. Bro, I have no idea how to read this. Am I going straight down, or when I finish this part I go over here? Bro, what? Is it like where do I read everything? Are these two pages? I'm genuinely confused. Give me a second. still here. I'm asking where I should turn. Mm, maybe not tonight. Or maybe not tonight. Oh, maybe not tonight. Oh, see your song and your own song. Okay, I'll just. I don't want to waste more time. But it's loading in, I guess. Few more minutes. I don't need you now. Or the don't think that you cry. I just adjudicate with an expressive view of dignity, great image. Um, there. Start here, I guess. Okay. I'll start there. Thank you. Okay. As an expressive view of dignity that relate to the act that embody and communicate moral attitudes about animals, and social dignity need not involve any natural harm. Indeed, the recipient of indignity may be unaware or even accepting of such treatment. At issue here is not just that the expressive qualities might promote future cruel treatment of animals, though that too can be an important moral issue, which even those relatively hostile. The prior kind of dignity centers on intrinsic moral features or natural features and associated with ethical implications. The dignity, like perhaps some utilitarians may acknowledge, rather the key point for proponents of social dignity is that expressing the diminished value of the other may itself wrong them. Social dignity may be at stake beyond circuses, various media, and zoo. Consider industrial farming. Factory farms causes pain, distress, and impoverished experiences for vulnerable animals, and animal advocates claim are cruel, unjust, or right violating. These are powerful central objections, but we might also worry about the intrinsic moral importance of instrumentalizing treatment that portrays animals as barely mattering. Factory farmed animals are kept essentially anonymous numbers and fungal commun- commodity fun fungible, my bad, and fungible commodities, lacking individuality, often forced to live in squalor before being casually dismembered and eaten. If if they were human, we would speak of extreme objectification and evil. Treatment that so effectively conveys the absence of real moral worth may thus be qualitatively different from, say, many isolated acts of animal neglect or harm. Thus, on the present understanding, not all wrongs or even right violations need to be dignity violations. On the other hand, some dignity related treatment seems seemingly embodies the moral view that an animal matters significantly. Consider a sanctuary that rescues objectified farm animals and gives them a name, a friendship group, and enjoyable work. Although this treatment is commendable because it improves animal welfare, it also be seen as respectful in the way it appreciates animals' nature and individuality, marked by their distinctive interests and preferences rather than as cogs in a machine. This may be seen as dignifying them. How do these expressive qualities arise? How do we accurately identify them? Also, all not only in some degree treatment not meant to belittle or show contempt for the victim. Some broad form of treatment that in some cases can be degrading, such as teaching animals tricks or letting them appear as characters in movies, are surely not always degrading to animals and might even sometimes be dignifying. If it if it appears that contextual details of animal treatment, including certain cultural features touched on in the next section, crucially matter in creating socially communicative means. Although the conditioning circumstances may be numerous, some such factors may be identified, including, as we saw, certain attacks on species, typical natures, and individuality. Second, identifying expressions of indignity and may eliminate. I don't know this word. Incapable of being eliminated or excluded. Okay. Second, identify expressions of indignity may not be able to be eliminated. Require human judgment and disagreement in is possible. Identify meaning treatment. Even so, there are may sometimes be reasonably wide agreement amongst impartial observers on instances of socially degraded animal treatment. Some degrading treatment appear to be associated with placing animals in certain extreme conditions that make it very difficult to appreciate their moral significance. Consider conditions that induce or discomfort, or disgust towards animals, such as highly sterilized zoos, farms, or lab conditions that foster torpor or aimless movement or obsessive play with genitalia or excrement. Although such treatment might sometimes stimulate compassion, it may also present an animal as an exceptionally odd or repulsive object worthy only of conde- condescension. Condescension? Con- Conscension? Conscension, okay. An attitude of prioritizing superiority, disdain, worthy of only consension and domination. We may see here a parallel with forms of dehumanization of human beings. Of course, treatment that obscures or drives attention away from moral worth could have powerful, if underappreciated, social conditioning role in perpetuating animal abuse and injustice, but degrading treatment that express what did okay do what deangatory derogatory. Let's bro kill me. Okay, denigratory. Okay, denigratory, denigratory. Okay, I did I get obsessed? But degrading treatment that express denigratory moral views may also be seen as morally problematic. Simply as such, this recalls the widespread view that human beings can be wrongfully degraded, even when they do not suffer physically or physically or psychologically. Mm. 5. Honor-based dignity. Social dignity, we observe, is relational, highlights kinds of contextual responses, perceptions, and treatments linked to moral respect. This respect encompasses repudicating treatment, repugnant. I don't, dude. Repudicated, repudicated. Oh my god, dude. Refuse to accept. I know what dark repudiate, 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 repudiate. Dude, why am I struggling to say some of these words? This respect encompasses repudiating treatment that expresses the perspective that an animal does not matter while embracing the contrary treatment. However, perhaps dignity can also be linked to expressions of disrespect, not necessarily tied to appropriate social moral recognition. This would still be a relational kind of dignity, but with a different focus and character. An example might help explain not that long ago it was routine and unexceptional for dead pets to be dumped in mass landfills. Many more people nowadays consider such treatment defiling and disrespectful to animals. Okay. My view is a bit different. I explain later. Okay, my voice be hurting, but it's fine. We can go on. Okay, where am I? Okay. Mass grave, something like that. A routine and unexceptional for dead pets to be dumped in mass graves. Sorry, mass in landfills. In landfill. Many more people nowadays consider such treatment. Never mind, I don't disagree. I thought it said mass graves. Um, well, there's some issues with mass graves, but I don't know. Many more people nowadays consider such treatment defiling and disrespectful to the animals. These people often seek to honor their deceased animal companions or family members with individual burials or serve a cremation, even though they know the animal cares nothing about their corpse. Such people may feel this necessary for respecting the animal's dignity and thus treating them well. Consider the next pre-mortem example. Imagine a veteran gives her client who lives on a farm a choice for euthanasia or of their terminally ill canine animal family member. She can either inject an anesthetic overdose or shoot the dog in the head. Both options guarantee a swift, painless death. Now, someone who cares about animal welfare but have no sense of animal dignity, or someone with certain theoretical allegiance, such as utilitarian concern, exclusively with welfare consequences, might regard either euthanasia or method as in itself respectful or acceptable, but many may feel like shooting the dog in the head is wrongfully defined or dishonoring. Define true dumping animals in landfills or shooting them might be taken as offense against social dignity insofar as these actions express and communicated the idea that animals matter little. However, people who nearly feel that such treatment involves indignity are not necessarily thinking in those broader social moral terms or in terms like welfare or flourishing. Their focus is quite different. They may simply regard not decree this desecrated the non-human family members body, and where possible give them a certain manner of death and a death ritual as right and respectful undertaking performed for the animal's sake. This honoring attitude and treatment seems to point to a relational meaning of dignity not reducible to social dignity. Honor based dignity. Social dignity, we observe, is relational, highlighting kinds of contextual. I already read this. Oh, okay. Degrading or defiling animals does not itself wrong them, hence, dignity towards animals do not exist. What many feel shooting the dog in the head is wrongfully defiling or dishonoring. Degrading or defiling an animal does not in itself wrong them. Hence, dignity duties towards animals do not exist. One possible rejoinder to this criticism is that degrading or defiling animals and humans does harm them without affecting welfare or flourishing. It is a moral harm, not a natural harm. Both types can harm a life, can make a life go worse. An alternative rejoinder is that dignity assaults are examples of non harmful wrongs, involving, for example, some form of moral disrespect. If the critic simply counters that harm or wronging must relate to affected natural well being, they appear to be begging the question. Consider now objections that animal dignity is unhelpful. Actually, I find this to be good. Where is it? Moral harm. I want to look into those terms. And moral disrespect. Moral harm. I'll go on field papers or somewhere else. Moral harm. Well, I won't find it here. Maybe somewhere on field papers. I am. I'm listening to music. Um, moral norms, negating moral harm. The moral harm of domestic abuse. Argue that victims of domestic violence characteristically suffer from two distinct types of harm: moral harm and moral injury. Moral damage occurs when the ability to develop or sustain good character has been compromised by an agent. Circumstances. Moral injury refers to a kind of psychological anguish that follows from when an agent causes or becomes causally implicated in actions that we ordinarily would think. What did I do? What did I do? Moral harm, the law, not law. I'll click this. No, wrong one. The moral. I'll click the. Some moral injury refers to. I'll click the one by Macy just to see what how she describes. Give a definition of moral harm so I can understand. It didn't see anywhere where this is being defined. Would a person can experience moral damage or injury overlap because abusers often expect their victims to adopt morally deficient dispositions and often implicate victims in wrongdoing. I argue that victims of domestic violence characteristically suffer from both moral damage and moral injury, both appreciating the difference yet overlap in moral experiences of the victim. We become better positioned to identify strategies for responding to and repairing the different harms they suffer. Bet you it costs money to read this. Never mind. I should shut up next time. Oh, it costs his money. I don't know, bro. Uh, uh, I'm not getting the whole paper just to find out what moral harms means. Okay. Harm often refers to a moral injury is defined as psychological harm incurred from actions that violate one's moral code, leading to feelings of guilt. proper definition. I'm just gonna use the definition the book provides. Um, and I'll highlight it. I'll just highlight it for now. It's not a moral. It's a moral harm, not a natural harm. Both types can make a life go worse. Okay. So moral harm can make a life go worse. An alternative rejoinder is that dignity assaults are examples of non-harmful wronging. Now I need to look at what non-harmful wronging is. Looks like this person can help me. Let's find this out. Non-harmful wronging. Uh, I'll type that in. Where non-harmful wronging. Non-harm. Bro, I'm just getting laws. Okay, involving, for example, some form of moral disrespect. If the critic simply counters that harm or wrong it must relate to or affect natural well-being, they appear to be begging the question. Consider now objections that animal dignity is unhelpful. Some reject dignity as too vague and indeterminate. It is true that it can seem to have confusing largely number of possible meanings. However, if we can disentangle and clarify conceptions of ethical interest, as we attempted earlier, concerns about dignity marked poly polemy should recede. Note also that the term like freedom, justice, and autonomy that bear many and sometimes conflicting meanings are nevertheless regarded as vital moral terms. Animal dignity has been and seen as practically unhelpful for merely gesturing towards respect without clear normative implications about what we ought to do. That criticism might land for some conceptions of dignity, yet we saw earlier how some forms of dignity can relate to various kinds of mistreatment and wronging in, for example, farming, science, entertainment, conversations, conservations, or human animal families. Certain kinds of dignity at least do seem to include or entail some moral guidance regarding animals. Another criticism is that dignity merely duplicates established moral terms, rendering it superfluous, or two relational conceptions of dignity, however, do not appear vulnerable to this charge of redundancy. Treatment involving humiliation, dishonoring, and defilement may be distinctive phenomena which the term dignity captures. But what about our two non-relational conceptions? Cannot these entirely reduce to the notion of inherent worth or high significance or flourishing nature and justice respectively? One reply is that dignity might do political and rhetorical work for animal, facing extreme moral invisibility and oppression. Dignity might convey animal moral significance more effectively, and if it could, if equally than said instead terms like inherent worth suitably understood, perhaps dignity can chime with rather than feeling alien or peripheral to traditional animal rights approaches. Moreover, it might be argued that dignity might be said. Might be said that dignity adds something genuinely substantive to well recognized moral concepts, such as inherent worth and flourishing nature. Suppose animals warrant compassion toward their bodily and mental fragility and dependency, a felt sense of waste and loss when their flourishing is destroyed, and we awe and wonder towards their marvelous nature and associated inherent dignity. Instead of regarding these responsives as criticisms, as animal dignity. Okay, six. Criticisms and discussion. Animal dignity is conversely, it has been criticized as defective, unhelpful idea. Reviewing criticisms of animal dignity will also allows for further comment and are for possible kinds of conceptions. Consider first the claim that animal dignity is a defective idea. For some critics, dignity as inherent worth all only makes sense for humans. Kant 2002 confines dignity to beings with rational autonomous nature. Non-rational animals have a mere price and lack dignity entirely, but since Kant time there has been growing recognition that animals have intrinsic moral worth, so dismissing the kind of dignity related to inherent worth outright seems too fast. Nonetheless, some fault animal dignity for trying to elevate animals' moral significance. So-called new dignitarians believe that a pronounced human supremacy over animals and a rejection of animal rights characterize human dignity. Other more sympathetic to animals and or shared animal nature may still reject human animal moral equality or egalitarianism. This latter group reservations might be tempered by recalling that while human dignity as internal right declarations emphatically affirm implies perfect moral equality amongst all humans and animals, dignity arguably need not entail moral equality between humans and animals. I'm just gonna speed read this. Let's just look at. Okay, there you go. We read through all of that. I just want to check one more thing. Where did that show me? I'll just keyword their name. I'm interested in what moral harm is fully. Valuing animals, they are. Did I get myself? Orax are in. Okay. How we val- how we value the psychology of species, though. Helping the ontological constraints of against harming animals. Yeah, in the first study I aimed whether people the ontological constraints against. I tested whether people consider experiments to harm one over the other, 5 pigs, to save one human, or to save 5 people. Many hypotheses was that in the case that people would still could not consider it permissible to harm pigs. My reasoning was multi-level way in the ontological hypothesis, namely that people the ontological constraints are outweighed by moral status they attribute to their respective individuals. Since people attribute much higher moral status to humans than pigs, their deontological constraints will be much higher for humans than pigs. Relatively, I hypothesized that different individual differences in level speech. Hmm. A second hypothesis was if there are different. I hypothesized that individual differences endorse an instrumental harm. That individual differences in the endorsement of individual. I'm gonna just save this link for later. Okay, I got the article saved. Finished with this one. I can go back to the other article. It's not article, book. Okay. Probably have to turn the screen off for a second and then switch over so nothing goes. Links. Open reset. And the article world status. Okay, we're back to this. Small detour to finish another article. Wait, what happened? Let's just move this. There you go. And we can finish that. I'll first need to plug that PDF inside GPT and just ask it to tell me what is how the word how the word moral harm is being used there. What's moral harm? And let's say someone punches another while in they never actually. I mean, people use moral harm in different ways, so we have to be careful. I know a ordinary harm, welfare harm. This is basic idea of harm. You make someone worse off. It usually means you cause them pain or suffering, or you take away something good that they would have had, like health, freedom, future experiences. Philosophers call this harm of deprivation. For example, if you lock a kid in a room their whole life, they never realize there's an outside world. They'll still think they're harmed because they are denied a huge part of a normal life, even if they never felt upset about it. So, on ordinary sense, harm equal worse for them. B dignitary slash moral harm. There's another kind of harm people talk about that isn't about pain or loss of pleasure. It's more like you disrespectful you disrespected them in a serious way. You treated them like trash, like an object, like a joke. That in itself is a moral problem. A philosopher describes these as dignitarian harms or dignitary wrongs. These are wrongs that don't always affect someone's experiences but still violates what they are owed as beings with moral standing. Example, spitting on a patient who's unconscious in a hospital bed, mocking them uh, to their face while they can't hear you, defiling a dead body. In those cases, the target might not feel anything and may never find out, but we still say the act is wrong towards that person in particular, not just rude in general. Why? Because the person is being treated like a prop or an object instead of like someone who matters. That's a direct insult to their status slash dignity. That's what some people mean by moral harm in stricter sense. You've attacked their standing, their dignity, their claim to be treated with respect, even if you didn't lower their moment to moment happiness. Some philosophers call that a dignitary wrong, and they treat it like a kind of harm to the person's status. So welfare harm, worse for their body slash mind slash life. Dignitary harm, worse in how they are being treated. You violated what they're owed. Two. Now the coma punch. Let's say a person A is in a coma, person B walks up and punches them. We can analyze that in two layers. Layer one, did you harm them in the welfare sense? Almost definitely. Even if they're not conscious right now, the punch usually causes tissue damage. Can make recovery harder. Can leave bruises, broken bones, swelling, etc. all of that makes their future prospects worser. They'll wake up, if they do wake up, in more pain with more healing to do, or with long-term effects that make them or that's ordinary harm. Even in extreme cases where they never wake up, you still damage their body, which is a part of what makes continued life or the possibility of recovery go well for them. So you deprive them of some good intact health they otherwise would have had. That fits the deprivation kind of harm. You've taken away goods they were on track to enjoy, which counts as harming them, even if they didn't feel it when it happened. So a punch in the coma patient, um, equals harm in the normal sense. Layer two. What if weird hyper the punch causes literally no bruises, no medical setbacks, no future pain? Let's imagine a very light tap that technically is a punch, but leaves no physical effect on them or later. Is that morally bad? Yes, it is still wrong, and here's why. When you punch the unconscious person, what you're doing is treating them like an object you get to hit for fun. The attitude, you're just a thing I can use or disrespect, is itself morally serious. Philosophers say that when you act like that, you're not just doing a neutral physical motion, you're expressing that this person is there for you to treat like a target, not as someone with inherent worth. That's a violation of the respect they're owed. That's exactly like the hospital example. A doctor spits on an unconscious patient, the patient never knows. Still, we say that patient, not just social, not just society, but that patient was wrong because they were treated with contempt instead of respect. That kind of act is what the paper calls treatment wrong. You perform an action towards a specific person with disrespectful attitude. You're basically downgrading them to tools or punching bags. Some philosophers would say that zero damage version, you still morally wrong them because you didn't harm them, because in this view, harm equal change their experience or welfare. Or other dignitarian harm will just say, nope, that is a kind of harm. It's a harm their dignity, status, even if it doesn't hurt. Either way, everyone seriously agree you did something morally wrong. Bad. 3 super shot summary, equal treatment doesn't matter, violating their claim to respectful treatment even if they never feel it. Okay. Okay. I'm gonna read the actual article, by the way. I'm not just gonna just read an AI summary of what I wanna read. Wow, this is beautiful. You should see what I'm seeing. Harmless wrongs. Okay. Get back to that original paper. Where is it? No. I'm playing too much. No, I want to read some of that paper. I want to read some of it. Harmless wrongs. In the previous section, I argued that animals can be both harmed and wronged when their experiential welfare is not affected. I explicitly, at times, implicitly defend a non-experiential based account of harm. Now, I will argue that even if the experiential account of harm is right, account of harm, we can still explain how animals can be wronged when their experiential welfare is not affected. Consider a paradigm wrong that harms, such as the act of maliciously stabbing someone to death. This act has two distinct aspects. First, there is harm causing action. I take an action to be intentionally bodily movement as opposed to mere behavior, which usually refers to atomic or reflexive bodily movement. Intentionally stabbing another is an action that negatively affects that experimental welfare of the one who is stabbed. Thus it causes something any plausible account of harm would categorize as harm, but not every harm causing action is is wrong. Suppose I see that Jake is thirsty and I intentionally hand him a cup of liquid that is actually poison. Though tragically, I mistakenly believe it was water. In doing so, I poisoned Jake and I harmed him. But I have not harmed him so long as I did not act recklessly or neglectfully. Surely, when someone accidentally harms another, even when acting intentionally, the harmer does not necessarily wrong the one who is harmed. Intentionally performed acts, an action that causes harm, then it is not sufficient for wrong, and for harm to be wrongful cause something beyond a harming causes action must be present. The second aspect of a paradigm of wrong. Da, 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 da. This is gonna take some time. I've been reading for nearly an hour and 40 minutes straight. Um, I, I don't want to leave it right here. I think I can continue to read. I think it's a bit lazy to not continue, at least up until 3 or 2. Um, um, Dignity. What? Where am I? I'll just start from here because I forgot a bit. Oh, I remember this line. Dignity, but some hold that cows, bees, and fishes don't as well. If we gave justifactory weight to convictions about who ought to be included in an account of dignity, then shouldn't we also give weight to these beliefs about who ought to be excluded? And since this will produce conflict with certain properties that might ground dignity, how ought those conflicts be resolved? To answer these questions, an important clarification is needed. Reflective equilibrium is not about giving unexamined weight to our beliefs. Convictions about particular cases of whether and when and whether a wrongdoing occurs act as a provisional judgment point to determining whether any particular conception of dignity is correct. To be sure, if we have an intuition about non-human animals do not have dignity, then that intuition ought to be in the okay, I remember this part. Fully remember this part. And that intuition ought to be investigated to see whether there is any coherence and well justified reason for holding it. However, if it is found that there are no good reasons or the reasons are incoherent with other principles and convictions, then that intuition ought to be rejected. On the intuition about excluding non-human animals, I think this is easily the correct conclusion. This intuition is more likely to just come from species ideas that are not well that ideas than from well considered theoretical positions. This is an instance in which a conviction ought to be revised if because it fails to cohere with a general justificatory picture. In other words, we ought to seek coherence between our beliefs and the justificatory basis for holding them. Where conflicts arise, we revise those beliefs which are the least plausible to hold, produce the most incoherent, and otherwise have morally undesirable implications. Using this method, I will argue that veiling sentience, compromising the capacity to value, is the basis for dignity. The process of reflective equilibrium tests this by leading us to consider our moral reaction to proposals that particular properties should ground dignity and how they will fit within broader considerations of value and its moral relevance. However, note that while I provide an account of the basis of dignity, I do not aim to solve the question of scope. We do not have the comfort of sharp line drawing when it comes to a question of this sort for two reasons. The first are epistemic limitations regarding knowledge of animal lives and experiences. The second are down to conceptual ones. We might be uncertain for all animal it's simply like okay, we might not be sure that all animals have valent sentience or can value things. Um uh it is simple as saying they either do or don't have dignity rather than sharp line drawing. I aim to like outline the kind of being tools lives do and do not have the moral importance associated with dignity. Section 2.3, 2.4 will focus on determining the necessary and sufficient condition for this, but I understand those conditions to identify gray areas. To justify these conditions, I will largely rely on thought experiments. While this means that that it may not be immediately obvious which being on the very margins fulfill the conditions, I will settle upon relying on thought experiments is the most plausible approach. This is because it adopts a theory light perspective according to which we search for markers of the relevant conditions rather than aiming to discover clear-cut evidence of them. On the one hand, real-world cases can be contrasted because research is still being done into measuring consciousness. The lines are therefore blurred. On the other hand, thought experiments will allow me to be specific about what characteristics are necessary for beings to have a vulnerability to be wrong in. I can see that this approach is not infallible. Not only can our considered convictions about these questions be unreliable, but much is likely to and should depend on scientific evidence about which natural property different beings possess and what mental states they can experience. Birch 2020. This produces a certain kind of epistemic and conceptual discomfort. Penna Guzman 2022 writes, "We will never fully capture animals in our conceptual, linguistic, and net hermeneutic net. Nonetheless, I adopt three strategies that seek to mitigate this epistemic and conceptual discomfort. The first is to acknowledge that the account I offer is sensitive to particular precautionary principles. If we are sufficiently uncertain about whether a particular property is morally relevant or whether a being does fulfill the relevant criteria, then we should err on the side of caution and assume they do. This principle is limited because there's a cost to assuming that entities have moral status in case of uncertainty. Specifically, we should be careful not to overascribe moral status in our reflective deliberation because this will have consequences for beings that we're almost certain do have moral status in trade-off and resources allocation. The second strategy is to realize that the account should be sensitive to scientific evidence by being multidimensional. That is, the basis of dignity will depend on the scientific evidence in at least two ways. Most importantly, scientific evidence will help us specify which beings actually fulfill the condition more accurately. In this sense, whether the being possesses the grounding properties will partially dictate our response. As such, we ought to open to the latest scientific evidence on cognition about which different beings might possess the relevant grounding properties, thereby determining more accurately which beings are bearers and non-bearers of dignity, and to reduce our reliance on precautionary principles. However, that evidence will also help us to adjust our conditions of who has dignity. That is the property that I will argue grounds dignity. Balin's sentience is a philosophical interpretation of the necessary and sufficient condition I defend. The interpretation may need to be adjusted depending on what scientific research discovers about what kind of mental states certain non-human experiences it can experience. Note that despite this, scientific evidence will not determine the basis of dignity, nor will it determine how we interpret the natural properties into an account of wronging. Since dignity is a moral property, not an empirics one, scientific evidence may therefore help us in more accurate specifying the scope of the condition on which dignity depends, but it will not straightforwardly determine what that scope is. Only philosophical arguments can achieve that. The final strategy is to ensure that the most plausible balance between conceptual parsimony and explanatory power. An account that is conceptually parsimonious makes a few conceptual commitments as possible, comes with far fewer conceptual costs. Therefore, it has much lower justificatory burden. This reduces the range of potentially fallible claims. If an account is parsimonious, it is less likely to make contested or implausible presumptions. However, parsimony is only a virtue of a theory insofar as that theory still has sufficient explanatory power. A primitive concept, a concept which is not explanatory, reducible to further concepts. A strong explanatory power if we can rely on the extension that a concept is elaborate and define further derivative concepts that can do explanatory work for us. This does not exclude the possibility that we might introduce a new primitive concept, but it does mean that the burden of proof is on showing why that concept is needed and what it adds to the account that cannot already be explained. This puts the onus on achieving a plausible balance between parsimony and explanatory power. Having clarified the above, two-step is to use the approach to argue that dignity can be grounded in two necessary and jointly sufficient conditions: the interest condition, the possession of theological interest, and the consciousness condition, the capacity to experience modifiable mental states. The third step is my argument. 2.5, 2.7 involves making sense of the moral relevance of these two conditions. This means explaining why these conditions jointly amount to valence sentience, comprising a capacity to value, and why this capacity has intrinsic value and therefore ground and dignity. My goal here is to make sense of what kind of life a being fulfilling these two properties lives, and why living this kind of life makes a being valuable to wronging, vulnerable to wronging. In section 2.5, my focus will be on working out the combined meaning of these two conditions. 2.6 will focus on the capacity to value that they produce is of intrinsic value. Finally, section 2.7 will build on the arguments I offered in the previous chapter to argue that this allows us to explain the position of dignity understood as deontic moral status. In concluding, I will explain why this account fulfills the condition for a successful response to the scope challenge that I outlined in the previous chapter. 2.3, the interest condition. Let us start with an argument for why the possession of teleological interest is a necessary condition for the possession of the capacity to value and for the possession of dignity. A being possesses teleological interest just in case they are the subject of teleological end and achievement that of that end is good for them. I think this is time for me to go to my vocabulary, and we can go scroll up. Necessary and sufficient conditions. That's gonna be good. It's so short. Give me a second. I can just read it right here. Uh, is there a way? Because I don't wanna get messed up. Give me a second. Maybe I can read that later in this one here. Wait until this goes to 2. I'll just read it right here. Necessary and standard Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Necessary and sufficient condition. First published in August 2003. Substantive revision on Wednesday 2022. Okay, a handy tool in search of precise definition is the specification of necessary or sufficient condition for the application of a term, the use of a concept or coherence of the phenomena of an event or event. For example, without water and oxygen, there would be no human life. Hence, these things are necessary conditions for the existence of human beings. Cockneys, according to the traditional definition, are all and only those born within the sound of bow bells. Hence, birth within the specific area is both a necessary and sufficient condition for being a Cockney. Like other fundamental concepts, the concepts of necessary and sufficient conditions cannot be readily specified in other terms. This article shows how exclusive the quest is for a definition of a term necessary and sufficient, indicating the existence of systematic ambiguity in the concept of necessary and sufficient conditions. It also describes the connection between puzzles over this issue and troublesome issues surrounding the word if and its use in conditional sentences. One, philosophy and conditions. An ambition of the 21st century philosopher was to analyze and refine the definition of significant terms and the concept expressed by them in the hopes of casting light on tricky problems of, for example, truth, morality, knowledge, and existence that lay beyond the reach of scientific resolution. Central to this goal was specifying, at least in part, the conditions to be met for correct application of terms. Um, Under which certain phenomena could truly be said to be present. Even now, philosophy unique contribution to disciplinary studies of consciousness, the evolution of intelligence, the meaning of altruism, um, the nature of moral obligation, the scope of injustice, the concept of pain, the theory of perception, and so still relies on its capacity to bring a high degree of conceptual exactness and rigor to discussion in these areas. If memory is a capacity for tracking our own past experiences, and witnessness then a necessary condition for a Pignolo remembering give what? What? Giving a lecture is that it occurs in the past, tracking our past experience and witnessing then a necessary condition for Penelope. What's a Penelope? Serious. Penelope is a character in Homer's Odyssey. She was the queen of blah blah blah, and was the daughter of Spartan king Icorius and Astrudoria blah blah blah. uh Mythology is known for her fidelity with to her husband Odysseus, despite attention, blah blah blah. uh I don't understand what it's just. Okay, remember giving in a lecture is that it occurs. For someone to remember giving a lecture is that it occurred in the past. Okay, that makes sense, because if you have to remember something, then that thought was probably about something that happened in the past, because you can't remember something in the present. Well, you can remember something in the present, but that remembering cannot be the remembering of something in the present, or it cannot even be the remembering of the remembering, the act of remembering cannot be something in the future. Because what you're remembering is something that has to happen in the past, which is necessary. Contrawise, that person now remembers the lecture is sufficient for inferring that it was given in the past. In a well-known attempt to use the terminology of necessary and sufficient condition to illuminate what it is for one thing to be cause for another thing, J.L. Mackie proposes that causes are at a minimum it is for one thing to be cause of another thing. uh J.L. Mackie proposed that causes are at a minimum in conditions that is insufficient but necessary parts of a condition which is itself unnecessary but sufficient for this effects. I'll end this there. Okay. And I'll finish up at 2.3 in the interest condition. That's gonna be interesting.